Greetings, scholars. I hope you're well. This lesson we're going to cover is on the civil rights movement. We'll talk about some significant events, some significant issues, and also some of the significant people. I prepared a PowerPoint for us, and we'll get right into that now. The civil rights movement. Plessy versus Ferguson set the stage for segregation. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated facilities for whites and blacks were legal, as long as they were of equal quality. Of course, they were never of equal quality, with blacks usually receiving inferior. Jim Crow and segregation. The separation of blacks and whites, border states and southern states mostly, but happened in all states, and took place in public transportation, in schools, in businesses, and was not only a series of laws, but also involved violence, job discrimination, and justice discrimination. Here's an example of a Jim Crow era law. You see a man climbing the stairs to the theater's colored entrance. Down here you see a door marked white men only, as blacks were not allowed to sit in the main gallery, but only in the balcony of the theater. This graphic shows the geography of hate. From the 1880s to the 1960s, 4,700 men and women were lynched. The noose still remains a terrifying symbol. In the past decade, there are still noose incidents. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, was founded in 1909 by W.E.B. Du Bois with the mission to promote full legal equality and to gain the right to vote. They also published a magazine called The Crisis. Roy Wilkins was one of the editors of The Crisis upon the departure of W.E.B. Du Bois in 1934. He served as president of the NAACP during the 1950s and 60s. His role in leading the nation into the civil rights movement was pivotal, as he spearheaded efforts that led to Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and eventually the Voting Rights Act of 1965. CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, was founded in 1942 to help African-American veterans of World War II who had been honorably discharged. At first, it was just a black organization, but eventually they integrated. In 1961, they began Freedom Rides, which were aimed at desegregating interstate buses. They also focused on organizing for black candidates in southern states, such as Mississippi and Alabama. 3 members were murdered in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of 1964. Charles Hamilton Houston is a very prominent African-American lawyer who was Dean of Howard Law School, first special counsel of the NAACP, and earned the nickname the man who killed Jim Crow. He's known for having trained future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Another important step is the desegregation of the armed forces. In 1948, Harry S. Truman issued an executive order establishing a policy of racial equality that it be put into effect as rapidly as possible. This is significant because it's the first executive order since the Civil War that dealt with racism and inequality. He faced opposition from a group called Dixiecrats. They are Southern Democrats who were after Southern states' rights. Strom Thurmond was their candidate in the 1948 presidential election and did receive some support in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. As you can see, Truman won, but the contest was not a landslide, as some papers even predicted that Thomas E. Dewey had won. Jackie Robinson integrated baseball on April 15, 1947 for the Brooklyn Dodgers. This is another significant turn in the civil rights movement because it showed blacks could excel in sports. Congress of Racial Equality is an organization founded in 1942 devoted to social change. As we know, they were initially founded to help veterans of World War II, but eventually became an integrated group nonviolent protesters. Whitney M. Young became executive director of the National Urban League. His main charge was to make sure major corporations were hiring Blacks. Through his charge, he was able to get many more hires through the big three car companies, as well as other corporations in America, and began seeing more significant promotions to managerial positions for African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. is always credited as the leader of the civil rights movement. He led peaceful marches, boycott sit-ins, and other nonviolent demonstrations. He was modeled after Mohandas Gandhi's nonviolent, passive resistance strategies. Mohandas Gandhi is most famous for a hunger strike. Rosa Parks, an NAACP secretary, was arrested on December 1st, 1955 in Alabama for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger, per a city ordinance. This began the civil rights movement and lasted over a year until November 1956. Brown versus the Board of Education is another important step in segregation and the civil rights movement. The Supreme Court reversed the Plessy versus Ferguson and ruled that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. Of course, there was pushback. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor tried to prevent 9 Black students from entering a public school. President Eisenhower sent federal troops to allow the students in. They became known as the Little Rock Nine. 14-year-old Emmett Till was murdered on August 28, 1955. He was lynched because a white woman accused him of having whistled at her. The men were tried for his murder, but of course, with an all-white, all-male jury, they were found not guilty. Some government officials were complicit in segregation and discrimination. One such was Governor George Wallace of Alabama. He opposed integration and attempted to prevent students from gaining admittance to the University of Alabama. One of his famous statements is segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. In 1972, he ran for president, but was shot and paralyzed. He later apologized for his racist ideologies and asked for forgiveness. Another such governor was Governor Ross Barnett. James Meredith was trying to enter the University of Mississippi. The governor said, "I shall do everything in my power to prevent integration in our schools." President Kennedy had to send troops there to allow James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. Robert F. Williams is a key figure in promoting armed Black self-defense in the United States. He was a Black nationalist and a supporter of liberation. He and his wife left in '61 to avoid prosecution for kidnapping. Medgar Evers was the director of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was murdered by a sniper who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. The SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, sought to unite leaders from the Black community, specifically churches, for the cause of civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. was the president of the SCLC when he wrote his letter from the Birmingham jail. His letter was a response to several white ministers who wrote a statement arguing that the battle for civil rights should be waged in the courts rather than by protest. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was founded at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, April 1960. They were devoted to the use of nonviolent protests for civil rights. One of their forms of protest was a sit-in, which is a nonviolent protest where Blacks sat in segregated places till they were served or arrested. They happened at lunch counters. They happened everywhere. They often had to train before participating in a sit-in, train for the beratement, for whatever they would endure so that they did not respond with violence. Another form of protest was the Freedom Rides, which were integrated bus trips. Eventually, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had to send U.S. Marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. Here's a background map of the 1961 Freedom Rides. If you look at it, you can see that there were 335 arrests, with 306 of them being in Mississippi. The March on Washington in August of 1963 drew over 200,000 demonstrators. They all converged on the Lincoln Memorial, where Dr. King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. This is an excerpt from "I Have a Dream." When we let freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The Nation of Islam is another group that was dedicated to civil rights. It was founded in Detroit in 1930 by W.D. Fard. After he disappeared, it began to be led by Elijah Muhammad. During the 1950s, it grew into every major city and attracted thousands with the doctrine of Black pride. Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam and quickly rose through the ranks. He criticized nonviolence. He called for a separate Black nation. In 1964, he broke away from the nation because of its violent ideologies and began preaching nonviolence. In February of 1965, he was assassinated. NAACP attorney and founder of the Legal Defense Fund for the NAACP is Thurgood Marshall. He's famous for his landmark legal victory in Brown versus Board of Ed, Topeka, Kansas. He eventually became the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited segregation in public hotels, restaurants, theaters, and discrimination in education and employment. Here we have a campaign launched in 1964 to get as many African American voters registered. This ended in a lot of violence as 4 civil rights workers were killed, 3 Blacks were murdered because of their support, 4 people were critically wounded, 80 Freedom Summer workers were beaten, 1,062 people were arrested, both volunteers and locals, 37 churches were bombed or burned, and 30 Black homes or businesses were bombed or burned. Some of the ways they used to prevent Blacks from getting the right to vote was literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and poll taxes. Here's an example of a literacy test. If you see, they had funny questions. Draw a line around the shortest word in this line. We all know you can't draw a line around. That would be a circle, correct? And here's a receipt of a poll tax. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed by Congress in 1965. It allowed for supervisors to register Blacks to vote where they had not been allowed before. The 24th Amendment served to protect the right to vote for Blacks by making the poll tax illegal. It led to a huge increase in African American voter registration, which in turn led to an increase in African American candidates who were elected. That will conclude today's presentation.